There are growing concerns over millions of rands worth of taxpayers' money used in legal fees for former and current public officials in different cases and inquiries. One example of this is the 77 million rand spent on the legal fees of R77m and others who stand accused of negligence in the Life Esidimeni matter. With the country's challenges, many believe that the money could be better spent on issues such as creating employment. Let's bring in now Mark Haywood, who is the editor at the Daily Maverick. Mark, thank you for making time for us. I mean, we live in a country where the so-called resource constraints has really become that mantra for every state failure. Whether you talk about providing quality basic education, you're talking about access to healthcare services, and then you hear 77 million rand is being spent for representing the people accused in the Life Esidimeni tragedy. That's a lot of money, and it doesn't help that the people are just pointing fingers and we're not seeing some accountability.
Yes, Clement, good afternoon. Yeah, I mean, it's a big problem. As I think you know, an inquest has been taking place into the Life Esidimeni disaster. It's been going on for several months now. And the purpose of the inquest is to try to establish the truth, and particularly to establish whether R77m and other officials from the Gauteng Department of Health should be considered criminally liable and therefore subject to criminal prosecution for their leading role in 144 deaths. And they have been represented by private lawyers, by private senior counsel, costing something like 50,000 rand a day in at least one instance. And that bill has now risen to 77 million rand, being paid for by a department that can't otherwise pay its bills and sometimes can't even keep food on the table at big hospitals such as Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital. So it does make you question the VIP treatment and the priorities that government has. It seems to be protecting its own rather than protecting the people.
Yeah. Whatever happened to the assistance from the Office of the State Attorney? Because that's part of the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. They can provide these legal services.
Well, I think that's the question that journalists like yourself, like myself, should be asking. I mean, we have got the state attorney to admit, to put in writing that they've spent 77 million rand, but they haven't explained what the policy is. They haven't explained why the state attorney's office, which exists for just this purpose, is not being utilized. The state attorney employs attorneys. It's meant to be there to assist government officials, government departments, and yet at this inquest you have 10 different legal teams all charging fees to the Gauteng Health Department, to you and me ultimately, and bypassing the state attorney's office almost entirely. So I feel like, this issue of the 77 million rand is not an expose that it's brought a truth that raises many, many questions that we need to continue to pursue.
And I suppose it doesn't help that there's no, well, at least to my knowledge, a policy to cap these costs of their legal representation.
Yeah. I mean, the 77 million was probably the amount that had been spent up until perhaps 2 or 3 weeks ago. Although the evidence before the inquest has ended on Friday, there still has to be closing legal arguments. There still will be a judgment by the judge in the inquest at some point, and quite possibly criminal charges may follow this. So it means that this 77 million rand will go up. It could potentially go up by further tens of millions of rands. And it goes up in the absence of clarity from the state attorney or from the Gauteng Health Department or the Premier, who's instructed that these fees be paid, as to whether there will be any cap on this at all. So we could end up spending 100 million rand of taxpayers' money representing discredited, dishonored, disgraced politicians and health department officials.
And that's going to add salt to injuries for the families of the victims. I spoke to one of the families of the victims yesterday who said there's still really not 100% payments when it comes to that compensation that was agreed on. So on the one hand, there's still responsibilities on the part of government to these families of the victims. But then on the other, you've got the same government that's still not keeping up with the payments, busy spending so much money on legal fees. This is not going to go down well with those families.
No, it's not. I mean, I speak to the families and to their representatives, and they're feeling a lot of pain, and they're feeling let down once again. As you said, it's not just that the compensation hasn't been paid. Former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke ordered a whole number of steps that needed to be taken, the building of a memorial to those who'd lost their lives. None of that has been done. And, you know, again, as you say, adding salt to the wounds is the fact that the families are represented in this inquest, but nobody is providing financial support to the families. They are getting support from organizations like Section 27. Section 27 is having to go out to raise funds to cover its own costs of providing this legal representation. So all in all, you know, it is extremely unfair, and I would say discriminatory against poor people and against mental health care users who died or who were tortured and harmed at that facility or as a result of closing that facility.
Yeah, let's contrast this lack of financial support, even for the families of the victims in this case, with the fact that you've got a government that feels it's okay to spend about 93 million rand upgrading the homes of ministers when there's so much financial need, whether you also even talk about, say, the 2.5 billion rand that Tshwane needs to upgrade their water, infrastructure so that people of Hammanskraal can have clean drinking water. There's so much need, so much that this money that seemingly is being wasted can be allocated for, and yet government for some reason are they out of touch? Is this lack of empathy? What's going on?
Clement, it's a very good question. Personally, I feel that they are completely out of touch with the lives of 80% of people in this country, and that is the poor of this country. Policy decisions keep on being taken that are causing tremendous harm. I mean, it's partly linked to our discussion now. You just need to take the latest increase in interest rates. You know, the harm that is doing to poor people. We are constantly being told as poor people that there's not enough money in the fiscus, that it's a time for resource constraints, there must be fiscal consolidation. But it's clear that fiscal consolidation applies to poor people, but it doesn't apply to elite people and to rich people in the government. It applies to healthcare services, to basic education services, to social grants that don't get increased in line with inflation. But it doesn't apply to ministers' houses, it doesn't apply to their legal representation, it doesn't apply to their security in the blue light brigades that they use, it doesn't apply to the costs of the parties and the banquets that the state puts on at various meetings and so on. And again, it's not fair, and it's not what our constitution envisages, because our constitution says that this is a government that must put the interests of the poor at the heart of all conduct and of all policy, and the opposite is happening.
Yeah. And when we talk about consequence management, if you set a precedent where these quote-unquote delinquent officials had to pay their lawyers out of their own pockets, I mean, surely that would get us to a point where any official in government who thinks about breaching the law is going to think twice about it, because they know even if there are inquests or court cases that follow, they are going to be responsible for those costs.
Precisely, and it goes back to your point about being out of touch with the people. You know, you could equally say that if government ministers had to use the public healthcare service, then they would be making sure that the public healthcare service is not starved of funds and resources and human beings. If they were funding the state attorney office properly, which they are not, it is underfunded, and that partly explains its poor quality of service, then maybe they would use the state attorney instead of once again going to the private sector. You know, it's a strange thing that this government constantly talks about inequality, about condemning the elites, about white monopoly capital, but it goes to quite often white lawyers, white power, etc., to preserve its own privileges, and leaves poor people stewing in the pain and suffering that millions of people are experiencing. It's all upside down.
Yeah, Mark Haywood, thank you for joining us for this chat.